Okay, so yesterday I was fortunate enough to speak and to actually even see my son for the first time in a few weeks. He's been in the middle of Gaza. Yesterday I was fortunate enough to be able to see and speak with my son, who has been in the middle of Gaza for the last couple of weeks. Haven't seen him in quite a while. And his gedud suffered 2 casualties yesterday, 2 severely wounded, and it was actually a miracle without getting into the exact details, which I don't know. I don't really know all the details, but and I don't know what of them are public. But the missile that was fired hit a place where additional armor had been attached, and that's probably why there are only a couple severely wounded and not more than that. So there's a lot to daven for. Our Chayeim there are really doing incredible things. They're under a lot of pressure. It's not just physical pressure, just psychological pressure. It's those if any of us here have been in battle, maybe you have a greater understanding. I certainly have never experienced anything like it, and they're willing to sacrifice a life and limb and everything else for our country. They just hope that it's not in vain. And I asked my son what we can do for them, and his only request was that we on the home front make sure that when this is over, that we don't go back to a Hamas B, to the terrorists from Ramallah taking over. If that's what we're fighting for, then all their sacrifices are for naught. So whatever we can do to make sure that doesn't happen that's their request. That's his request. This is whole Gedud's request. I'm sure it's the request of basically every single one of our soldiers there. So if we can do what we can, and so we'll start with Parak of Shir Ma'alot. It's up on the screen. Shir Ma'alot Esayna El Heharim Me'ayim Yavo Ezri Me'im Adonai Yosei Shamayim V'aretz Al Yitein Lamot Raglecha Al Yanom Shomerecha Hine Lo Yanom V'lo Yishan Shomer Yisrael Adonai shomerecha, Adonai tzilecha, al yad yaminecha. Yomam hashemesh lo yakeka, v'yareach balayla. Adonai yishmorcha mikol ra, yishmor et nafshecha. Adonai yishmor tzeitecha uvoecha me'ata v'yad olam. Achinu kol beit Yisrael הנתונים בצרה ובשביה העומדים בין בים ובין ביבשה מקום ירחם עליהם יוצאים מצרה לברכה מאפלה לאורה משדות וגאולה השתה בגלה בזמן קריב ונאמר אמן. two prefatory comments. One, there's a little bit of a misnomer in billing what I'm here today for and last week as a shiur. I don't really give shiurim. What I do is share learning environments and learning platforms together with others in order that we can all learn not just the particular content that we happen to be speaking about today, but that we get tools and methods that we can then apply in our learning on our own. And as Danielle described it to me, Danielle from Sara, the purpose is not to provide fish, but to provide fishing hooks that we can all use in our learning. And that's one of the reasons. That's the main reason why when I give shiurim, i.e., really sharing learning environments, that we use the Ala Torah platform and that we try to share the tools that it can give us, so that we can all use it in our own learning. If there's anybody who has any trouble seeing the screen, so that you can also access it on your phones, alhatorah.org, and you can follow along. So if anyone sitting in the back has any trouble seeing anything, please do that.
The seats here too.
Seats up front also. Yeah, just gotta be careful with the cords. Okay, this week's Parashat Chayei Sara, is all about basically life cycle events. Burials and so bereavements and marriages. There's three basic stories, or three prakim in our parasha. The first parak Kaf Gimel is the story of the burial of Sara, which I guess is the end of Avram's first marriage. Parak Kaf Daled then describes the process of Yitzchak finding a wife. And Parak Kaf Hey speaks about Avram's additional marriages and then his burial. So that's basically our parasha is describing life cycle events that over the last few weeks have certainly been a major part of our lives, with the marriages going on in spite of the war, because of the war, and unfortunately with the more difficult bereavements aspect. What I'd like to take a look at together today is Parak Kaf Daled, is the middle portion of our parasha, which is the bulk of our parasha, the story of Yitzchak finding a wife. Or maybe it's not even Yitzchak finding a wife, it's finding a wife for Yitzchak. And if we think about one of the useful techniques when we analyze a story in Tanakh, is to compare it with other similar stories. So we have certain, especially when we have stories that form a type scene, that have when we have stories that are very parallel to each other, and each of the stories will have certain elements. We'll share certain elements, and then there'll be certain unique elements that are unique to one of these stories. So the story of finding a spouse in Tanakh, if we had to come up with other examples, our parak is certainly not the only case where we have a story about somebody finding a spouse. Which other stories can we think of? Yaakov finding, so a couple prakim, 4 prakim, 5 prakim later, and so a couple parshiot later. So we'll have Yaakov searching for a spouse. And that may be the closest story to our story. What other?
You go to Tanakh, Achashverosh.
Okay, so I don't know if he's looking. I don't know if he's looking actually for a spouse, but he's looking for something or other. So he's looking for multiple ones maybe. But yeah, absolutely. Achashverosh and Esther. Good. Moshe and Tzipora. So even though Moshe isn't sent by his parents or isn't sent by anybody to go find a spouse, but that story is very similar to ours. It has certain elements that are clearly very distinctly parallel to ours. Namely, Well, right. I'm sorry. Well,
Ruth and Naomi.
good. So Megillat Ruth. So we have Megillat Esther, Megillat Ruth. So Megillot are well represented here. So Naomi looks for a spouse for Ruth. Any other ones? I have. There aren't that many in Tanakh. I can think of a couple others from Nevi'im.
Samson and Delilah.
Shimshon. Okay, excellent. So that's another funny one because we wouldn't exactly use him as a model for what we would recommend that people look for in a spouse. But Shimshon, and that takes us back to Asa. Okay, so we have Shimshon.
Adam and Chava.
Adam and Chava. Okay, so that's another good one. I wrote that when I jotted that down on my list. I put it in parentheses. Because I don't think that Adam himself was necessarily looking for a spouse, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu basically decided that Adam needed a spouse.
David and Michal.
David and Michal, right? So that was the other the other one from Nevi'im that and there may be one more that I think we can consider. Good. So we're almost. I think everyone has gotten I think I'm out of with the exception of one more. That takes care of everything I could think of.
Yosef?
Yosef marries, so he's given a wife, but I don't know that there's much of a story about Yosef marrying. But we could think about it if we just if when we're doing further analysis of this type of typesetting, so one could jot down all those things and then see which elements it shares.
See how to go way out of it, out of his framework.
Right. There's certain elements that might share, and that's exactly the issue here. And when we compare these types of stories, so defining what exactly is in the category and what isn't in the category, that's part of the issue. And there'll be a question, I think, of how many elements these different stories share. Now, if the only other one, which I'm sure if we thought about it long enough, people here would come up with it, is Achsa and Kalev, Achsa and Otniel, where Kalev looks for a suitable husband for his daughter Achsa, and he says, "Whoever will conquer Kiryat Sefer, so I will give him my daughter Leisha." So that's, and Otniel ben Kenaz is the first one of the Shoftim, so he's the one who conquers Kiryat Sefer, and he marries Achsa. Now, of all of these stories, I think our story is unique in a couple important ways. Anyone have any thoughts? What as to anything that would distinguish it from some of the other stories?
Well, the future of the Jewish people depend on this choice.
Okay, good. Probably by Yaakov also. So we would say those two. The earlier back we go, so the more it's going to impact on the entire future of the nation. Good.
He asks for a test along the way.
Okay.
He asks for a trial. This should happen, and then I'll go.
Very good. So we have a basically some sort of nisayon going on here. We have some sort of trial test, and one of the questions that I think we have to ask ourselves is how critical that test was for selecting a wife. Now it takes a big portion of the perek, so it seems like it is pretty important. But that's going to be one of the issues that will come up in the Mefarshim, and that's excellent. Now in the case of Otniel, for example, and Achsa, so there is something of a test to see who would be worthy. In the other cases, it's less of an explicit test. But
David is Goliath.
yep. So by David, so Shaul asks for a dowry, and initially whoever was going to kill Goliath, so he was going to be the one who would be able to marry the king's daughter. And then Shaul ups the price, and David has to give him 200 orlot plishtim. So that could be another case. In the cases of Yaakov and Moshe, so I think there is a demonstration of qualities that takes place. The story is telling us that Yaakov displays some sort of certainly great strength, some concern. In the case of Moshe, where he chases away the Roim who had basically abused the daughters of Yitro. So Moshe is demonstrating certain qualities that obviously make him show why he's his special character. But in the case of Yitzchak, so the Nisayon of the Be'er certainly plays a very outsized role compared to any of the other stories. And the truth is, the story itself is much longer and much broader than, much more detailed than any of the other stories. I think there's also a second element, which is I think we have to go through the list. But in all the other cases, we're looking for a husband. Am I right on that? All other ones, and any exceptions? I think this is the only case where one's I guess Yaakov was also, that's not right. So what I said isn't true. Okay, so by Yaakov, right? So what I had in mind was that this is the only case where it's the female's qualities that take center stage, with the possible exception of Esther, where it's her beauty is why she's being selected. So I guess even that isn't a total unique aspect. But as opposed to, let's say, the other ones in Torah, where Yaakov, Rachel and Leah don't demonstrate any particular qualities. Rachel's Yifat Torah, Yifat Mareh, but there's no active demonstration of some special qualities. In our story, we really do have that. Now, why is all this important for us? So I think these issues, and there's a lot more to be said and done, and one could make tables and charts with more detailed comparisons, and probably come up with all sorts of other important things. But I think the big issue that we have in our story is what is the factor that's most important for Abraham, for his servant, for the Eved, and ultimately for Yitzchak in looking for a wife. What were they looking for? What's the focus here? And these issues of what's unique in our story, I think, shed some light on that question. Now, here too, like we almost always have in analyzing stories in Tanakh, we have the issue of the omniscient reader. The reader knows the end of the story. The reader knows that the Eved is going to make this great big test, and that Rivka is going to pass with flying colors this great big test. And that almost overshadows everything else that we know. But let's start with the initial few psukim of our parak. The Avraham Zakein. Hey, we got better pointers than last week. I hope no. Let's try that again. The Avraham Zakein ba bayamim v'Hashem beirach et Avraham bakol. Vayomer Avraham el avdo zakan beito hamoshel b'chol asher lo simna yadecha tachat yirechi v'ashbiacha b'Hashem elokei hashamayim ve'elokei haaretz asher lo tikach isha livni mibenot hakanaani asher anochi yoshev b'kirbo ki el artzi ve'el moladti telech v'lakachta isha livni leYitzchak. So Abraham has reached a ripe old age, and Hashem blessed him with everything. Why exactly we need that preparatory remark here? So it's a good question. We'll come to I think to a couple possible answers. So he says to his servant to swear to him, and what is the Shavua? It has two parts. This promise that the servant oath that the servant has to take has pasuk gimel and pasuk daled. There's a negative formulation, asher lo tikach isha livni mi benot hakanaani asher anochi yoshev b'kirbo, that he has to swear that he won't take a wife from the daughters from the Canaanite women. And then verse 4, ki el artzi v'moati telech. This is the positive side of the coin, the flip side of the coin. But rather, the servant should go to Artzi and Molati and take a wife from there for Yitzchak. Now, anytime we have both a negative formulation and a positive formulation, we have to ask ourselves, what's the relationship between them? Which one is more important? Which are they both important? Is one just v'habor reik ein bo mayim? So is it just two ways of saying the same thing? Or even in that case, sometimes the midrash will explain that there's an element that each one comes to teach us. So that's our question here. Are these just two flip sides of the same coin, or are these two different factors that go into this? Is there something against the Canaanite, or is the reason that we can't take from the Canaanite, that the servant can't take from the Canaanite women, is just because he needs to go to Artzi and Moleti? The second question that we have to ask ourselves is that we have another doubling here. We have a doubling within verse 4, within Pasuk Dalet itself. Artzi and Moleti, exactly. We have two terms. Ki el artzi ve'el moleti. What's the relationship between those two terms? Now that, of course, depends on one very important question. Right? Of those two terms, which one's the easier one, and which, at least do we think, would we think is the easier one, and which one is the more complicated one? So artzi,
Artzi is more attractive. There's conquest.
Artzi seems easier to translate. Artzi, I think most people would translate something like my land. But what about Moleti? Birthplace, okay. Anyone else?
Culture, family environment.
Okay, family environment, culture, birthplace, yichus, lineage. Okay, so we got a few different possibilities as to what Moleti is. So what do? So the first thing, obviously, that's important to us in knowing what's the relationship between El Artzi and Moleti, and that's going to be critical probably also for understanding the relationship between Pasuk Dalet and Pasuk Gimel, is what tool? What tool can we use for this? So we can look at the Mefarshim. That's an excellent tool. And if we want to recreate the process of what the Mefarshim themselves were doing, so I'm sorry. Okay, so the tool for that, if we're looking for other cases of a word, is a concordance. So what we can do is we can click on this word, molati, and automatically we'll get, with one click, we'll get all of the occurrences of moledet in Tanakh. Now this is in essence when the Mefarshim, right, the two methods here are really one and the same. When we talk about the Mefarshim, looking in the Mefarshim and seeing how they understand the word, well, the Mefarshim, they didn't need to use Al Torah because the Mefarshim had Al Torah and the concordance in their heads, right? So they knew. So I mean, it sounds a little funny, but basically, if you had asked Rashbam or Ibn Ezra or Rashi, to list you all the different places where the word moledet appears in Tanakh, they would have probably, if they didn't come up with all of them, they would have come up with the vast majority of them. And we will see that they cite them. The Mefarshim are always, when they're defining words based on the word's appearances in other places. Because what happens? A word will appear a certain number of times in Tanakh. In some cases, it will be more ambiguous. In some cases, it will be less ambiguous. So we use the less ambiguous places to shed light on the places where it's more ambiguous. Now, in our pasuk, we didn't have a whole lot of context for Artzi ve'el Moleti. So we know it has something to do with Artzi, but is it the same as Artzi? Is it the opposite of Artzi? Is it a second level of Artzi? That we don't know. But if we examine all of those other psukim, and we'll come back to them in a second, or at least in a couple minutes. So then some of those other psukim will be able to shed light on our pasuk. Now there's a little bit of a complication when using that, because sometimes words can have multiple meanings, or they can have multiple shades of meanings. So there's no method that's going to give us one single answer, and that will be the only possibility. But it will certainly help us and give us a lot of food for thought. Now we'll come back we'll come back to Moleti, But first, we'll take a look at that second method, because the second method, sometimes it's certainly a crutch. Basically, using mefarshim can be viewed as if we need help and we don't want to do all of our own analysis, so then we can go to what the mefarshim say. Now, of course, we go to the mefarshim not just if we don't want to do our own analysis, but we go to them because their analysis is a lot of times more sophisticated and profound than ours would be. But the other reason why we go to the mefarshim is because the mefarshim don't only give us one answer. Because when we have so many useful mefarshim that are at our fingertips, so then the mefarshim will give us a spectrum. The mefarshim will give us a way to compare and contrast different possible opinions. And we see that in almost every case in Torah. And by analyzing the difference between the mefarshim, then we're able to delve much deeper in and get a much finer appreciation of the Torah and all of its details. So we're going to take a look at a couple of the basic mefarshim on pasuk bet here. Pasuk Dalet, ki al artzi ve'el moladti. So if we take a look at Ibn Ezra, ki el artzi, zot Haran shedarshan, moladti, or kasdim. Now this is a fascinating Ibn Ezra. Ibn Ezra says that artzi is a reference to Haran, which would be in Syria, and moladti is a reference to Ur Kasdim, which would be in Iraq of today. Two different places. We know of Haran and Ur Kasdim from the end of Parashat Noach. Terach and his family leave Ur Kasdim and they arrive at Haran, and then from Haran, Avram then migrates to Eretz Yisrael. Now, what's two questions that I think we need to ask ourselves about Ibn Ezra. First question is, what's motivating Ibn Ezra? Where did he get that Artzi is Haran and Molati is Ur Kasdim? What's going on here? Yeah.
The pasuk says El Alzi ve'el Molati, implying two different places.
Mm-hmm. So if we're assuming that we have an A and B, so Ibn Ezra wants to figure out what the A and B could be. But that highlights a real problem that we have, because El Artzi Zot Haran, in fact, gets carried out in the Parashat. The Eved goes, where does he go to? El Aram Naharayim Elir Nachor, and Aram Naharayim Elir Nachor we know is Haran, at least almost according to almost everybody. Or Kasdim, the Eved never goes to. So what would Ibn Ezra? What must Ibn Ezra be intending with this somewhat cryptic comment?
You can't find it in Haran.
Presumably, exactly, that there's a plan A and plan B. So the Eved's plan A is to go to Haran. If he's unsuccessful in Haran, then maybe he would go back to Ur Kasdim.
But the pasuk doesn't say either or. It says El Artzi Viv, implying he's supposed to go to both of them.
Excellent. So Vavs, sometimes in Tanakh, most of the time in Tanakh, we would interpret them as additive Vavs. So El Artzi ve'el Molati, and then Ibn Ezra has a little bit of problem, because why is the Eved supposed to go to both Haran and Ur Kasdim? But Vavs can also, in not infrequent cases, can sometimes be an or, can sometimes be a contrast. So we have multiple possible meanings of the vav, and in this case, Ibn Ezra would obviously interpret this vav as an or. So that's Ibn Ezra. But you can see that that's one of the difficulties, one of the things that isn't so smooth about Ibn Ezra's readings. Ibn Ezra's reading, because Artzi and Molati can't go together. The A and B, it's an A or B according to Ibn Ezra, or at least an A. If it's an A and B, it's only if A doesn't work. So then we go to B. To take to see a contrast to Ibn Ezra. So let's take a look at Rashbam right on top of him. So Rashbam and Ibn Ezra are contemporaries. Rashbam was born in northern France. Ibn Ezra was born in Andalusian Spain. But at a later point in his life, Ibn Ezra escapes a persecution in his native land, and he travels around, first moving to Italy, then moving to France, and then later in his life getting to England. And in each of these different places, Ibn Ezra wrote different commentaries. And that's why we have an Ibn Ezra Aleph here, because on parts of Breshit there's also an Ibn Ezra Bet. So the first commentary was written in Italy, so that's the Aleph that we have here, and that's the only one that survived on all of Breshit. Ibn Ezra, the Perush Bet, Perush Hasheni, was written in France. And in fact, Ibn Ezra's second commentary, when he wrote it in France, it seems there's significant evidence that he actually had a copy of Rashbam's commentary, and sometimes he reacts to Rashbam's commentary, almost always to disagree with it. So Ibn Ezra, this is Ibn Ezra Aleph, is Ibn Ezra HaKatzar. That's a misnomer, really, HaKatzar, because sometimes the Katzar is more Aroch than the Aroch, and sometimes the Aroch is more Katzar than the Katzar. So really, they should really be referred to as the first commentary, the first commentary is the Italian commentary, and the second commentary, which was written in France. And it's interesting frequently to compare Rashbam and Ibn Ezra, especially when there's more than one commentary of Ibn Ezra. Because then sometimes the differences between Ibn Ezra's two commentaries are influenced by his interaction with Rashbam's commentary. In our case, though, we only have one commentary. But here too, Rashbam and Ibn Ezra are very different. How does Rashbam understand the words Artzi and Molati? So Rashbam says, El Artzi, but not to those who aren't my relatives in my land, but rather to Molati Shebe'artzi. So what does Molati Shebe'artzi mean?
Tedek.
I'm sorry?
Tedek, but is it? Yeah, but it's Tedek.
So what Rashbam is saying, and we'll see it clearer in a second in other places in Rashbam. Rashbam is defining Molati as Mishpachti. So the way Rashbam is reading our pasuk is that you should go to my land, and what's the need for A and B in our pasuk, both Artzi and Molati? Because Molati is specifying we're moving from the more general term to the more specific term. So as opposed to Ibn Ezra, who is presenting them as really an A or B, or an A and B only if A fails, Rashbam is saying it's A and more specifically B. It's a klal uprat. One place, only Haran, and the servant only goes to one place. He doesn't go to more than one place. And who specifically should you be looking for in my place? It should be someone from my family. Now, Rashbam didn't say that 100% explicitly here. We just get it from this Rashbam. We only get it from the negative formulation. Below the otam sheinan krovai is telling us that obviously Molati is the ones that are krovai. That's what we can gather from Rashbam. But Rashbam says it just enlarge which screen?
This screen right there. This we're looking at. Can you enlarge it a little?
No, the projector doesn't. This is the best it can do.
Okay.
But if you want, you can follow. If there's something you can't see, didn't take out a phone, you can follow it on your phone. So Rashbam, though, what we can is that I don't think it's going to make it bigger. Yeah, that's better. Perfect. Excellent. Okay. Excellent. Great.
Tons of suits.
Thank you. Okay. So now I can see the screen also. So what's very important when we're learning a parshan is we want to be able to see the parshan's individual remark on this pasuk, and we also want to be able to see this parshan in context. And context actually means two things. Context can mean his relationship to other mefarshim, and that's why when we frequently learn from a tool like a Mikraot Gedolot, rather than learning from something that only has one parshan. Because what a Mikraot Gedolot does for us is it gives us the ability to instantly be contrasting. And if we have to go open the other book and then bring it, or bring two books, and going back and forth between things. That's the whole reason why when we have a Shas, we have Rashi, and we have Tosot, and we have Rabbeinu Hananel. The same thing with a Rambam. When we learn a Rambam, or we learn a Shulchan Aruch. Does anyone learn from a Shulchan Aruch which doesn't have any commentators? No, we learn from a Shulchan Aruch that's full of commentaries on the page, because that's how we learn. Same thing with the Mikrot Gedolot. So on one hand, we want to learn Rashbam, and we want to be able to compare him right away to Ibn Ezra, or to Rabbi Avram ben Aramam, who we'll see in a second maybe. At the same time, we want to be able to see how is this Rashbam consistent with everything Rashbam says in the rest of the chapter. So if we click, we have a little button here, which when you use Al Torah on your own, because again, that's the whole point here, that everyone should be getting used to how all the different features that one can use that will enhance your own learning. So if we click on this button here, so this will give us Rashbam, the entire perek of Rashbam. So we'll see that the part of the reason that Rashbam is a little shorter here in our pasuk and didn't say it and didn't spell everything out is because he's already spoken about this issue in pasuk Aleph. And if we recall, so we had that question before as to why this perek is introduced with that Hashem Beirachet Avraham Bakol. Why is that important? So Rashbam addresses that in his comments on the first pasuk. So Bad Bayamim and Beirachet Avraham Bakol, there were two elements in that pasuk. Rashbam says both of them are important introductions for what comes in the continuation of the parak. How does it work? Bad Bayamim v'harei higia eitz lahasiet beno bechayav. So because Abraham was getting on in years, so it was clearly time for him to marry off his son if he was going to see that wedding. Second element, Beirachet Avraham Bakol, lehodia ha'amur lefanenu. Now this is a principle that Rashbam employs, and other northern French Parshanim employ it on a very frequent basis, and it's one of the principles that modern literary analysis of Tanakh also uses very often. Lehodia ha'amur lefanenu, as an introduction, when you have the sword in the first scene or the gun in the first scene of the movie, and it got slipped in there, you know it's going to be relevant for what happens later on. This detail is going to be important for the continuation. Shelo shalach abadav lakachat isha mimishpachto machmat choser nashim be'eretz Canaan shelo yehu rotzim lizdaveglo. It wasn't that Avram couldn't find a nice young lady in Eretz Canaan to marry Yitzchak because he was poor, he didn't have any resources. Everyone wanted to marry into Avram's family. Sharei mitbarech bakol, v'chol ha'olam mitavim lihizdaveglo, aval hu lo ratzah ki im min mishpachto. So Rashbam gives away his position right away, that Avram's whole goal here is to find a wife from his family. V'zehu she'amar ha'eved v'Hashem beirachet adoni me'od vayigdal. And that's why the servant, when he then speaks in the subsequent psukim, after he comes to Haran, he tells the family that Hashem, don't think that Avram's sending me here because he couldn't find anyone there. Hashem beirachet adoni me'od vayigdal. He was blessed with everything. Now here one could have said everything Rashbam said without discussing the issue of whether he wanted to marry from his family. One really could have suggested that the reason for this first pasuk of Beirachet Avraham Bakol is so that simply that we would understand that later pasuk of Hashem Beirachet Adoni Me'od Vayigdal. And that's why our pasuk prefaces the parak telling us that this has happened, and that way we'll understand that when the Eved says it, that we already know that information. So Rashbam could have said it in a very technical way, but he says more than that. Because it wasn't just in order to be able to understand that pasuk, but that pasuk is an important part of the story. That's the message that the Eved is giving the family, that you should understand that Avram is choosing you, that Avram wants a wife from his family. And if we read the story in that light, it has a major, major impact. Because one of the questions that we'll then have to ask about Parak Kaf Daled, about our whole story, is that if the Avram is sending the Eved to choose a wife for Yitzchak from his family, and that's the most important criterion here, then what's strange?
The big test that needs to be a kind person who waters.
The big test that the Eved then presents for who's going to be the worthy wife is missing
The family.
the most essential ingredient. According to Rashbam, Avram didn't send the servant to find a wife that was the biggest balat chesed, that was crazy enough to draw water for 10 camels who hadn't drunk in 10 days or whatever. And who would want to marry somebody who's so crazy enough to be such a balat chesed? There's limits to everything. Of course, I don't mean that seriously, but Rashbam doesn't say that. Rashbam says he's looking for someone from his family. So the most important ingredient, according to Rashbam, the most important criterion, is missing in the test. Now Rashbam has a way of dealing with that, and we'll see. We definitely will get back to that issue in Rashbam. But I'm pointing out that question to understand, so that we can understand why Rashbam's position isn't so simple, because that's very important. Basically, when we have a machloket between the parshanim, it's very, very rare that one position is overwhelmingly better than the other position. There's almost always advantages and disadvantages to each parsha. When we have a machloket between the Rambam and the Rabbi, it's not that one of them is crazy. When we have a machloket between Rashi and Tosfot, it's not that one of them is crazy. Generally, there's reasons for each one. There's certain methodological differences between the different parshanim. Sometimes they are consistent with positions they've taken in other places, and frequently we'll have psukim where one pasuk will be more supportive of one position, and a different pasuk will be more supportive of a different position, and then each parshan will have to reinterpret, will have to sand down the second pasuk, which doesn't work as well for their position.
He only asks about a family afterwards. He first gives it a touchy team, and then after only when he meets.
Okay, so as long as you raised that point, so we'll take a look. So we'll take a look at those psukim. So we can open up with on top of the psukim. There's also an icon there to see the entire parak at once. So we'll take a look down at psukim kaf, starting from pasuk kaf bet. Vayhi ka'asher kilu hagemalim lishtot. Everyone with me? Kaf bet. כאשר קילו הגמלים לשתות, ויקח האיש נזם זהב בקע משקלו, ושני צמידים על ידיה, 10 זהב משקלם. So this is after Rivka has passed the test with flying colors. And the servant takes out nezem zahav and shnei tzmidim. He takes out the jewelry. What doesn't it say he did?
He didn't ask about the family.
He didn't ask about the family yet. What else doesn't it say? We read that closely. Vayikach ha'ish nezem zahav beka mishkalo u'shnei tzimidim al yadeha 10 zahav mishkalam. It doesn't exactly say that he gave it to her. It says u'shnei tzimidim al yadeha. Now that can be read in two different ways. What are the possibilities? One possibility is that he took them out in order to place them on her hands, but it doesn't say nezem zahav al apa, right? So that's a little bit of a there is a little bit of a difficulty in that reading. The second possibility, ushnei tzimidim al yadeh, it's telling us that he already placed them on her hands. So he took a nezem zahav beka mishkalo, and it doesn't tell us that he placed that on al apa. So either way, there's going to be a little something not so simple here. But he takes the shnei tzimidim and he puts it al yadeha, and there's a implied giving which isn't mentioned in the verse. What would support that possibility? Anybody think of a different verse in the parasha which might support that?
She showed her brother what she had.
So obviously at some point he gave it to her, but that could be after the subsequent psukim. Right, Vayomer bat miyat in pasuk of Gimel, he then asks her what is, which family are you from? Hagidi nali hayesh beit avich makom lanu lalin, and she tells him, bat betuel anochi ben milkash or yavadal nachor. So it could be that at that point he gave her the jewelry, and then she ran and her brother saw the jewelry. So that pasuk, so that would we wouldn't necessarily know from that, but
that's the story that he tells her family.
Exactly. So we have a second part, a retelling, when the servant tells the family about what happened. He retells the story. And one of the things that is so nice when we have a retelling is that we have a built-in foil. Now we have a tool it's called the Tanakh Lab, which can be used for this type of case. Now it's a little hard to use on a screen like this. It's much easier on your personal computers. But what one can do with this tool is one can put in two different sections from Tanakh, and then you press a button, the Hashavua button, and it will compare them. And here, so in this type of case where there's a very obvious comparison, so we can compare the first part of our Parashat, where Parashat Daled, Psukim Aleph through Kavav, where the Torah tells us what happened in this story, how the servant went to Haran, and how he performed the test, and what he said to Rivka, etc., etc. And then we have, in Psukim Lamed Daled through Memchet, we have Vayomar Eved Abraham Anochi, we have the Eved's story, when he recounts what happened to Rivka's family. Now, the useful thing about this is not only to see the similarities, but also to see some of the differences. Now, as I mentioned, it's going to be a little hard to use this tool altogether right now, but we also have a table which will help us. Which will help us in a slightly clearer way. Now, what this table does is it highlights in red all of the almost identical language between the narrator's story and the servant's retelling of what happened. Then it colors in blue where we have words that are similar but not exactly the same. And then in green, we have more significant differences. Now, we'll see as we scroll down, we have in green here, I hope everyone can make out the words in the back, Artsi ve'el moladti. So in the narrator's telling of the original story in the Torah, the Eved is sent to Artsi and Moladti. In his retelling of the story, he says he's sent to Imlo el Beit Avi Telech ve'el Mishpachti. So the light bulb should be turning on. Obviously, this is going to be very significant for the Machloket Mefarshim as to how to understand what Moladti is. Right? We have a parallel description here, and instead of Moladti, we have either Beit Avi or Mishpachti. Most likely, if we're preserving the order, we have Artsi and Moladti, and we have Beit Avi and Mishpachti. Now, either way, Artsi isn't really paralleled by either one of those terms. Yeah.
What about the fact that the order is different in the two different places? How does that pick that up immediately, or how does that get determined? Yeah.
We're about to get to that. We're scrolling down. So we can see right away where Mefarshim, who understand that Moladti means family, it's not just a birthplace, but it's the family that I was birthed into. So we could see very clearly why they would get that reading. Because if we want to make the servant's story match almost exactly the original story, so then Mishpachti should parallel Moladti. Now there's obviously alternatives. We'll get to that in a second. But now let's get to the ordering difference. In the original Torah's telling of the story, so which we read before, that was Kaf Bet, Kaf Gimel, Kaf Daled, and Kaf Hey. So the Eved takes the Nezem and the Beka, then he asks Bat Miat. then he asks, which family are you from? When the Eved retells the story in Pasuk Mem Zayin, Va'esh'alota va'omar bat mi'at va'tomer bat Betuel ben Nachor asher yaleda lo milka. So that's why that's in red, because that's almost identical with what we have in Pasuk Kav Gimel. But Va'asim hanezem alapah ve'atzimidim al yadeha comes only after he finds out which family she is from. So that's why that's in green, because even though the nezem and smidim are the same words, but we have to indicate somehow that something changed. So according to Rashbam, who says that the servant was sent to take a wife from Avram's family, so what would he say? That when the Eved retells the story, that's the way it happens. The Eved's telling the truth. He asked her first, which family are you from? And she told him, and therefore now he knows that the test worked. So the test, according to that reading of the story, is meant to find a woman from Avram's family.
Why should the Torah change?
I'm sorry?
Why should the Torah change in the original?
So we have a couple questions. So that's actually, I think, the easier question. There's a more complicated question. Okay, but since it's easier for me to answer the easier question. So why in the initial story is it told differently? So according to Rashbam, it's not told differently. Now if we look at Rashbam, if we go back for a second to Rashbam on Pasuk Kaf Bet. So Rashbam says, ויקח האיש נזם זהב, יש לומר שאחר ששאל לה בת מיעט נתן לה, כמו שכתוב לפנינו בסיפור דבריו. אלא שלא להפסיק סדר דבריו ותשובת דבריה, לכן הקדים מעשה נתינתו שנתן. So Rashbam's answer to this question is consistent with his whole reading of the story, and almost always Mefarshim are consistent. When Mefarshim take a position, they are influenced by what they say about details in not only in that story that they're dealing with, but the way the words appear in other places in Tanakh. When Mefarshim they aren't randomly giving their positions, and we'll see this all the time. Mefarshim have basically the whole Torah in their heads, all Tanakh in their heads, all at once.
Were they affected by the Sheva mitzvot, the B'nai Noach? I mean, they seem. I mean, if you look like what goes on now, even in America,
They the Mefarshim, or they the characters in story?
No, in other words, their understanding of the intimacy, you have a wife, and that in this way. It wasn't, like even in the modern world now, the secular world, where you have, I did this with groups in Pittsburgh, you have a group of 10 people, 15 people, and they all had like 3-4 different marriages, or, the whole system broke down. That's why I said I want to find out whether they were affected by, the main question was the Sheva mitzvot. In other words,
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. We have to, but certainly something to think about.
It could influence how they were looking at things.
I don't know.
That's why I asked. Okay.
Yeah, good question. I don't know the answer.
Okay.
Okay, so Rashbam says that what happened was le'achar shesha'ala, only after did he give her the jewelry. And why does the Torah make it sound like he gave it to her beforehand here? And as we saw, it doesn't actually explicitly say that. It doesn't say that he gave by Yitei. But why does the Torah even mention the jewelry beforehand? Kidei shelo lehafsik seder devarav. This is a principle that Rashbam also employs in many different places in Torah. Sometimes when one's telling a story, one tells certain details out of order, in order to preserve thematic order. Because basically we have chronological order and thematic order when we're telling a story. We have the exact time, the exact second that this event happened, but sometimes we rearrange things because there's certain events that are more connected to each other. So first, Rashbam says that if we look at our parasha, so Rashbam, so the Torah is describing everything the Eved does, and then he talks about bat mi'at, Bat Betuel Anochi. She says Gam Tevin Gam Mispo Ravi Manu. The Evet says Baruch Hashem Elokei Adoni Abraham. So we have a whole conversation that then transpires as a result of her identifying herself. Rashbam says the Torah preferred not to break that up with a giving of the jewelry in the middle, but rather to continue that, and therefore it introduced the jewelry beforehand and got it out of the way. What? I'm sorry?
Is it a bit dachok?
It's one could certainly, I certainly wouldn't argue with anybody who said that Rashbam is a little bit dachuk here. I would prefer that the option which other Mefarshim take, which is what I hinted at before, is that the Vayikach is that he took it out anticipating. He's already knows this gotta be right. Now I have to be doubly sure. I'm going to confirm, but it's already out. Frequently that happens to us. We have a feeling, we know, we have an instinct that something is right. I mean, after all this, for her not to be from Avram's family, so it would have been it would have been the biggest disappointment. So I would prefer that reading of the pasuk, and there's also a second element, which an Italian parshan by the name of the Hillel Moshe. We're short on time, so I'm not going to read it inside, but it's part of the Mikrot Gedolot. It's one of the most interesting Italian parshanim of all centuries. He lived at the end of the 19th century, and he wrote a Pirush on all 24 books of Tanakh. And there's almost no Mefarshim that we have that wrote on all 24 books. And what the Hillel Moshe suggests here is that when we think of a city, so we think of a city that has all sorts of families, right? In Yerushalayim, not everyone's related to each other. Cities in that time were much smaller. So when he went to Aram Naraim El Ir Nahor, the city of Nahor, that was literally the city of Nahor, where Nahor's whole extended family were one of the biggest and most important families in that city. So he suggests that the likelihood of not finding a wife from Avram's family once he went to that city was very small. So you could take that approach as well. But there is a certain difficulty. Now, what's the alternative to Rashbam's interpretation? So basically what Rashbam has done here, in both places, in both major differences, if we go back to our table here, right, we had a difference in the ordering here, and a difference as Artzi and Molati, and Beit Avi and Mishpachti. In both cases, what did Rashbam do? He said that what actually happened was the left column, was the Eved's, was the servant's retelling. Avram really told him that it has to be from Mishpachti. That was the most important criterion. And the Eved first checked to make sure the woman was from the family in order that he fulfill his mission before giving the jewelry. So in both cases, the servant's retelling is what actually happens, and then we have to explain why the Torah initially gave us a little more ambiguity as to what was possibly happening. So in Pasuk Daled, Rashbam says that Molati means Mishpachti, and in the ordering, he has to explain that, he has to maybe be a little dachuk, maybe fudge a little, and we saw their alternatives. Yeah?
Is it possible that he understood when Avram told him Mishpachti, he was talking about not just my family, but someone like me that has my qualities, that you've seen chesed, etc., etc.?
It could be. That would be a metaphoric reading.
So there's no other metaphor that's...
I wouldn't say there's none. You have to check. You have the tools. You have the tools to check. I'm sure you can find somebody to support that position. Now, quickly though, what's the alternative to Rashbam's reading? How else could one account for the differences between the two columns here? Yeah.
I think it was Rabbi Liebtech in this very room 2 years ago who said that the Eved was being a salesperson.
Right. Good. So there are parshanim a little before Rabbi Liebtech, but I'm sure he was citing somebody when he suggested it. So it's he doesn't need to cite Al Torah. There are plenty of Mefarshim before Al Torah. He uses Al Torah, but he doesn't have to but he wouldn't have to cite us. So the alternative, there are a few alternatives to Rashbam. I'd like to take a look at one of them together, and we'll look at and that alternative is formulated by the Malbim, and the Malbim is throughout the Perek he adopts this position. We're going to take a look at Pasuk Yud. Vayikach ha'eved. I'm going to blow this up a little more, so that way. Vayikach ha'eved. Hinei Abraham lo hishbio, rak sheyelech el artso ve'el molato likach isha misham. Hainu sheyikach isha me'ir Haran. V'lo hikpid shetiyeh dafka mimishpato. שעיקר היה בעיניו שלא תהיה מבנות הכנעני. ובזה היה שליחות העבד שיחקור אחר אישה הראויה ליצחק, היינו שתהיה יפת תואר וטובה בשכלה ובמידותיה. ויותר מזה לא ביקש, כי אברהם לא רצה שיהיה אביה עשיר או שר גדול, כי השם בירך אותו בכל. Similar to the way Rashbam uses that, but very different than Rashbam in his entire approach. What does the Malbim say here? The Malbim says, if we look at the story, Avram sends the Eved, he tells him, El Artsi ve'el Molati. And the Malbim, like Mefarshim, like a whole bunch of other Mefarshim, not like Rashbam, who came before him, understands Molati as a simple birthplace. He's sent to take a woman from Haran. And that's all that Avram specifies. The lo hikpid. And Avram didn't have any special preference that it would be dafka from his family. The important thing is, going back to the very beginning, was we had a negative and a positive. Lo tikach isha mi benot Canaan, and go to Artsi ve'el Molati. Now, according to Rashbam, the focus was not so much on the negative. It wasn't that Canaan was so terrible. Now maybe they were, but that wasn't the focus here. The reason why he couldn't take from Benot Canaan was because it needed to be from Avram's family. For the Malbim, the important point is the negative. Going to Artsi and Molati is just a way of not taking the Benot Canaan. And the Malbim, if one reads the Malbim throughout the Perek, so then one will see that the Malbim develops this, and what's the problem with Canaan. And as we know, there's lots of problems with Canaan that the Torah describes in other places. So Avram didn't want to intermarry with the people of the land of Canaan. But there was no special need for him to go to his own family dafka, and therefore, according to the Malbim, the test makes a lot of sense. And the way the Malbim would now, going back to our table, so the way the Malbim would say is Artsi and Molati is not Beit Avia Mishpachti. But what is the Eved doing? What the servant is doing is he's trying to kiss up to the family. Right? He wants the family to think that Avram is interested specifically in them. And the difference in the ordering, according to the Malbim, so which happened first? So according to the Malbim, the test didn't require the woman to be from Avram's family. So he took out the jewelry as soon as she passed the test in this incredible way. The servant takes out the nezim, the jewelry, he gives it to her, and only then does he ask. And that was icing on the cake that it was from Avram's family. In the retelling, just like he changes the telling of the story in the beginning to say that Avram didn't just want Molati, but he wanted Mishpachti. So too, when he tells this aspect of it, he changes it in order to butter them up, in order to kiss up to the family. The one last position that I'd like to just quickly read one little piece from is the Perush of Shadal. Shadal gives a third view on this whole story, which is different from each of the first each of the two views that we've seen until now. Meaning, until now we've seen that Rashbam, it had to be dafka from Avram's family. The Malbim, on the other hand, that it just had to not be from Canaan. Shadal also emphasizes this aspect of Asher lo tikach isha livnei mibenot haKanani, that is very, very key here. But he explains it in a different way. She'im haya mitchaten bahem, shuv lo yitachen liYisrael lehorish haKanaanim me'artzo, acharei heyotam achim. What would have happened if Avram's family had intermarried with the Canaanim? So for the Malbim, what's so terrible about that would be all of their midot. Right? The Canaanim represented a whole way of life that was the antithesis of the tzedakah mishpat, of the monotheism, of everything that Avram represented. Shadal says it's a very practical consideration. If Avram marries into the Canaanim, and basically what will we have? We'll have intermarriage. We'll have assimilation. How can Avram create his own distinct nation? Avram right now is a few people. If he intermarries into a much, much vaster population, it's going to be very, very difficult for him to create an Am HaNibchar, for him to fulfill his mission. Part of this approach is also the reason that some Mefarshim explain was the whole need for us to go down to Mitzrayim. In Eretz Yisrael, where had we just remained in Eretz Yisrael, there was a great danger of intermarrying, like we see in Bayit Sheni when they come back, like we see even throughout Bayit Rishon, there's all sorts of intermarriage taking place. But that was after at least we had some critical mass. We had our own national identity. The only way that that national identity could be formed was by having to go down to Eretz Mitzrayim, which was a xenophobic society, where by external pressures we couldn't intermarry. We had to form our own nation. We had to paru yishutzu b'yirbu b'yatzmu b'momnot. And only then, as once we had become a nation with our own identity, religious and national political identity, could we go back to Eretz Yisrael. What we have here are different views, and we've only touched a little on a few of the interesting ones. Different possibilities as to when people look for a spouse, what they're looking for. So for Shadal, for example, the material aspects of being able to and Shadal isn't even emphasizing only the religious aspects, but we have a concern of all sorts of identity politics that gets into things. We have a yichus issue. We have for the Malbim, the test that the servant that the most important criteria is chesed. We have qualities. We have midot tovot. That obviously I think most of us would put at the top of our list when looking for a spouse. So all of these issues that we have in our parasha are of course related to certain textual issues, to word issues, which I apologize we never got back to the concordance. But if we look at on our own, if we take a look at the word moledet, so we'll see that there's different psukim that will support the different interpretations. So that's one group of factors that are involved. We have literary factors, comparisons between different tellings and retellings. We have different type scenarios where we have, for example, in the case of Yaakov. So Yaakov is sent, and the pasuk there says explicitly, "Lo tikach isha mibnot Canaan," just like by us. But by Yaakov, the Torah says explicitly, "Kum leif padena aram beita v'tuel," to go specifically to the family. So that's another factor that can come in. So parallels is something that Mefarshim use very frequently when they are interpreting and formulating their positions. So when we learn, we try to use all of the narrow scope tools, the broader scope tools, concordances, different Mefarshim, and hopefully that will help us gain a richer interpretation and richer understanding of Torah.
But aren't we finding things on our brothers in Gaza?
I'm sorry, again?
Aren't we finding artistic relatives in Gaza?
What kind of relevance, sir?
The people we're finding in Gaza, some that